Y'all remember this motherfucker?
Counting or not counting gang violence?
He died getting ready to launch into the same racist tirade that has been debunked for decades. And he's making the same point as his very obvious inferior copycat, which is simple.
We need to stop blaming anyone else for gun violence because black people, only in Chicago and definitely related to gangs, are killing more people than any mass shooter ever will.
Now let's ignore the obvious what about fallacy that this is, and just take it at a face value. This is an impossible statistic to compare because the numbers are simply representing different things, depending on how you calculate the cutoff for what constitutes a mass shooting incident. If you go off of 2 or more, that puts death as high as 1,000 to 1,500 per year. If you go off of 4 or more deaths, then AP puts that rate as high as 390 in 2019, which is the same as the amount of total homicide deaths in Chicago in 2025. So the whole mass shooters aren't an issue angle is simply false. But then you have to think about the homicide deaths. The calculations for homicide deaths are including mass shootings as well as crimes of passion, domestic violence, gang violence, botched burglaries and robberies, organized crime hits, you name it. And 64% of arrests for homicide in 2025 were of black people, but that doesn't guarantee a crime that was committed in 2025, nor does it equal a conviction for those crimes. And this is in Chicago, by the way. This doesn't even account for the fact that the clearance rate for homicides of black people in Chicago are significantly lower than other victims. So there's no telling what percent of perpetrators are actually caught. So this gang violence or black people doing the killing numbers is impossible to calculate and incapable of being compared to mass shootings as a whole number because it doesn't represent number of victims in relation to number of perpetrators because the arrests and convictions are not indicative of number of killers. And Chicago isn't even the highest rate of homicide. St. Louis is. Chicago is just a bigger city with more people, so even a small fraction of a big number will just be a big number. But when you narrow mass shootings to nihilistic violent extremists, the specific thing I'm talking about in the previous video, their rates of murder and injury are increased. So this very specific number of nihilistic violent extremist deaths is a lot more concise than the questions left open by the homicide victim count taken from crime statistics. So even if the number is not bigger, death by mass shootings is a number that is worth considering, especially given that it's increasing, while general homicide, especially in Chicago, has been decreasing year over year, and that it is tied to a very specific thing that we know the cause of. And when you look at what Mr. Commenter here is saying, it becomes even dumber. He's interpreting that because I am saying the mass shooter epidemic can be solved if we address the root cause because it stems from one single root cause. But he's interpreting that I want to blame white people for all gun violence in America. Which gets back to my point about how hard it is to get white supremacists to do any form of self-reflection. To this person, and anyone like him, 2 things can be true at once. We can have general crime and homicide, things we know can be largely curtailed by certain forms of community intervention and enrichment, while also having an epidemic of nihilistic violent extremism tied to white supremacy. Nihilistic violent extremism can even be lower than general crime, and that doesn't mean we don't address it, because the things we do to address general crime do not address nihilistic violent extremism. Because if you know there's an issue and you know the cause, you'd be an idiot to not address it. Crime is being lowered by good community-based measures, but nihilistic violent extremism is still on the rise. And the only way to stop it is to stop defending white supremacy, as this commenter and anyone else like him are ostensibly doing. And start support healing, because the real gang violence comes from the friends you've made along the way.